G'day, guys. Somebody actually asked me about, the current conflict between, or friction or tension between Greece and Turkey, and sort of the claims and counterclaims and all that. So what we're going to do is we'll cover the treaty that stipulates sort of the extent of territory, what belongs to whom, and what doesn't belong to whom, and what the treaties say and what they don't say, what people claim. All the sources that I'll be using will be legit sources, and there'll be nothing from Greece, absolutely nothing, and nothing from Turkey. And that's deliberate because basically no biases in terms of the sourcing. The rest will be my personal opinions about this situation. But as far as the documents go, they will be the documents from independent sources, not anything that I've conjured up or using, so nobody can claim that. They can go and validate these sources for themselves. I'll put all links and provide connections to that. So that'll be pretty much it. Now, just a bit of a background. Recently, Erdogan was in the making a speech in the UN. Then recently also there was a speech done by the Greek Prime Minister as well. I think he could have said things slightly differently, been a bit more polemic, a bit more strong in his condemnation against the regime, not the people. At the end of the day, there are many good people in both countries and reasonable people, but there are also lunatics, as all societies have them, as they say. But at the end of the day, the regime in Ankara is on a collision course, a war collision course against Greece. It's quite clear and all that. The opposition are no better. So I don't. Some people think if the opposition comes into power, things will quieten down. I don't think so. They have joined in bagging Greece, and who can bag Greece the most sort of attitude. So there's a lot of hostility and and nationalistic fervor that's actually happening over there, and the sort of language that is being used is quite nasty. Well, we're going to come at night and we're going to slaughter you and stuff like that. So it's not very friendly, let's put it that way. So, and let alone sort of arguments about human rights violations. What a loaded crap, to say the least. I mean, Frontex is there, which is the European organization that actually protects borders, and they've been involved and assisting the Greek Coast Guard and the border forces of Greece to basically deal with, this hybrid warfare that Turkey's using immigrants or refugees and forcing them across the border to to undermine and create problems and tension between the two countries. It's part of this whole campaign where they want to create instability within the region to exploit it. They've done a few little things similar by financing little groups and terrorist groups in northern Syria to destabilize things there as well. So it's nothing new and nothing old. They're again violating the Treaty of Lausanne because they're not allowed to go into that territory. It's off limits by the treaty. But anyway, they just ignore that as well. And they've actually ethnically cleansed a northern strip of Syria of Kurds. So that's also a violation. Well, it's ethnically cleansing a whole region and removing people is sort of a violation of international law, a severe violation. It's akin to genocide. It's not like killing people outright, but ethnically cleansing is a sort of a low grade type of genocide of a culture and people from a region because you're expelling them from that area. So it's akin to in that regard. So it's quite nasty things, and Erdogan, just because he's part of in NATO, he seems to be able to get away with a lot of things, which is quite outrageous. But they've been holding off. The Americans have been holding off some of his military toys, and that's why he's throwing spat the dummy a couple of times, and but what does he expect? When you're a revisionist and you don't respect your treaty obligations, you don't respect your neighbours, and you use, you attack and threaten your neighbours, well, it's a violation of international law. It's a violation of Article 2. You can't threaten other countries. They've actually got a casus belli, which is sort of if Greece exercises its international rights of extending its territory by 12 nautical miles, it will basically, they will declare war. I mean, it's an outrageous thing. It should have been condemned a long time ago, and sanctions should have been exercised on Turkey for this is even predates Erdogan, but he's continued it. He could have removed it at any time, but he didn't. And so, as I said, the opposition's no better when it comes to their foreign policy or good neighbourly behaviour. Now, a lot of Turks, I don't believe, the majority of Turks are reasonable, good people. They're not evil people, but they've been whipped up with this frenzy and lies and stuff like that by the deep state of Turkey, which is a corrupt state, a corrupt, xenophobic, fascist state, which has this hostility to anyone. It comes from that tradition of Kemal Ataturk, who basically was, the father of genocide in Asia Minor. Many people, millions died at his hands, particular Armenians to a less. Then the second biggest group was Greeks, and the third group was Assyrians. So there was basically three genocides in a sense against, and to a lesser extent, a small amount of Arabs as well. That the ones that sort of collaborated were left alone. The ones that didn't were knocked off. Nowadays, basically, he's going after the Kurds, and they've been doing it for quite some time. Rather than basically, I mean, the Kurds many years ago had actually had come to an agreement to basically, stop their fight, get some regional autonomy, have their culture and language respected and all that. But basically, they were betrayed, and these people were taken captive and then locked up and pretty much or knocked off. So, there's not a lot of trust between them, especially when you try and negotiate a deal and then you get knocked off. So, I mean, I don't consider personally myself the Kurds as terrorists, since they are fighting a national liberational war to liberate their homeland, which is legit. There's well over 25 million people. I mean, that's a big population. If they don't deserve a nation, I don't know who does. That's a joke. At a minimum, they should have some level of autonomy or regional control. No different than, the Scots or have in the UK or any other society which has a big ethnic group, and they have a certain regional that have been there for many years, for long years. They're indigenous to the land. They've got, so, it's wrong what's happening, and it's wrong that people are kowtowing to Erdogan and his, crazy politics. It doesn't help. It doesn't help the Turkish people in the long run. Peace with the Kurds would be a good way. They could even remain within Turkey as an autonomous region with some rights, language rights, cultural rights, and stuff like that. That's all they were asking in the past. It's basically because they were attacked and continually being attacked and trying to be forced through forced assimilation that basically the Kurds have said enough. We're not going to basically be forced to become Turks. We're going to basically demand and fight for our own country. And that's legitimate, Unfortunately, the deep state within Turkey is very xenophobic. And, if you're not Turk, basically you're the enemy sort of attitude. And it's a criminal state, it's involved in drug running and people trafficking and all that sort of stuff. It's, let's say, some of the leaders have got a very questionable, let's put it that way. And they're well known in international circles. It's just they don't get a lot of media coverage, which they should really. It's just it's quite everybody seems to basically deal with Turkey in cotton wool, But really, even for the Turks, it would, getting rid of the deep state and these nasty people would mean that they would start realizing that it's best to live in peace with their neighbors, because any conflict or any war, especially with the Greek people, because we're very much evenly matched when it comes to military hardware, would be devastating for both societies. It's not it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Um, you know, and our Prime Minister did say one good thing, that said that, the majority of people, well, in Greece, don't view the actual Turks as the enemy. And I'm hoping that it's likewise. It was in the past. Turks didn't. Now there's been a bit of a frenzy of nationalism that's been whipped up there. I don't know what the numbers are in the country. I think it's probably split 50-50 between those who are very hostile and those who aren't. But it's really hard to say. But things are not looking good. And Erdogan basically wants a conflict, maybe to save his skin, because he can push the election down and stay in power. I don't think he even cares about Turkey anymore. It's just basically staying in power is his main goal, even if he was to, there was a war and some level of devastation, because he has moved towards the Grey Wolves and sort of this really ultra-nationalist, fascist type groups. And, if you take, those groups don't really care. It's really holding on to power and their way. That's their ideology. And if they can actually even accept a smaller Turkey, as long as they're in power and their ideology is dominant. And it's a dangerous mix. A lot of people could die on both sides for no good reason. It's just crazy stuff. But let's cover some of the treaties and some of the stuff, all that, and some of the claims and counterclaims. So we're quite clear what belongs in the Aegean to the Greeks and what belongs to the Turks, and what these sort of demilitarized and militarization of islands and all that, what all that covers, because there's a lot of talk about that. But let's look at the actual documents, rather than actually look at all the nonsense that people say out there, because they do say a lot of things in that regard. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so this is basically Brigham Young University. This is in America, and this library is, so it's a library, lib.byu.edu education. This library is a congressionally designated depository for US government documents. Public access to the government documents collection is guaranteed by public law, US law. Title 44, United States Code. So they hold treaty documents and all sorts of other government documents from around the world. So this is a legit source and nobody else's. Okay, so let's cover, we'll go from the articles that sort of cover. So I go to there's a treaty. I'll just cover this really quickly. Treaty of Peace with Turkey signed at Lausanne, July 24th, 1923. Okay, so the parties to this treaty: the British Empire, France, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, the Serbo-Croat Slovene state, which is what turned into Yugoslavia eventually, and Turkey, the other party. Okay, so we'll leave that behind and move on. Okay. So these are territorial clauses laying down from the Black Sea to the Aegean frontier. Okay, so it covers different countries. They go through all the different countries. And this is just a sort of a general outline. There was actually a commission as well for the borders, but and this was set up because the actual Evros, which is the river between eastern and western Thrace, basically the river course can change. And so sometimes little islands can emerge and then vanish as the water course changes. So there's a commission that basically covers a lot of these things. Turkey hasn't actually been involved, has withdrawn from the commission, which is illegal. They're supposed to stay with, use this independent commission to determine, and that was working very well until Erdogan recently sort of pulled the plug on it, and so you could create all these controversies. But the Greek authorities maintaining with where the actual, and the position, the GPS positions are known. Okay, so that's quite clear. It's just basically to depict each time something emerges on one side or the other, to basically tell people that that new piece that has emerged that's all it was. It's very simple, uncomplicated or whatever, but that was the purpose. And now, by not attending, it basically creates this ambiguity when there isn't, because the reality is there are radiation points from specific areas which delineate, I'm a cartographer, delineate basically the actual line. So survey points delineate the actual bit of line. We know where it is. It's in international documents. Everybody knows it. I'm not going to cover that because that's not the big issue. That's just a side issue of that, to create an additional controversy if we don't have enough in the Aegean. The main claims, they're not making any claims there. It's basically in the Aegean where they're making the claims. So that's where we'll cover the key areas. That's where the key controversies are. So really it all starts from Article 12. Okay, so the decision taken, blah, 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 on the 14th at the Conference of London. So these are all sort of leading up to the final sort of treaty regarding the sovereignty of Greece over the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean, the other islands of Imbros and Denado. I'll cover that specifically because there were eventually, these Greek islands were handed over to Turkey to protect because they demilitarized the Bosporus as well. It was a demilitarization of the Bosporus. These islands were handed over so it would basically provide security to the Bosporus for Turkey. That was the reason why, but there were Greek populations on there, and there were provisions which have been completely violated. So we'll get into that eventually. Particularly the islands of Limnos, Samothraki, Mytilene, Chios, Samos, and Ikaria is confirmed subject to the provisions of the present treaty respecting these islands placed under the sovereignty, and certain islands that were placed under the sovereignty of Italy, which are subject to Article 15. I'll cover the islands, which is the Dodecanese Islands. So we're quite clear about those. And basically all these were stipulated to be Greece, but then, under the previous arrangements, but then they were, under this treaty, though, these two were handed back to Turkey, just these two. And I'll discuss that further down. So, because Turkey basically says, oh, well, they only named these islands. What about all the other islands that are in dispute? No, they're not. These are the big islands, which you can put military forces on. That's why they were named. So there could be restrictions and provisions for those. That's the only reason. On small islands, you just don't put military forces because it's useless. What, a couple of square meters, it's ridiculous. Or islets or little rocks or stuff like that. Let's be serious now. So, but they actually provided where the stipulation of the boundary lies, except where a provision to the contrary is contained in the present treaty. The island situated at less than 3 miles, okay, from the Asiatic coast remain under Turkish sovereignty. That's all. That's it. Done. As far as the Aegean goes, anything of the Asiatic coast that's within 3 miles, that was the distance of a cannonball in the past, was 3 miles, not 3 nautical miles like some ignorant people say. Even in Greece, they use that. Some reporters who are just have no idea, they've never read the treaty, they just blabble and repeat the same nonsense. It's 3 miles and not nautical miles. Okay, let's make that quite crystal clear. So anything within that belongs to Turkey. Anything beyond that point belongs to Greece. It's quite clear in the treaty in Article 12, except what belongs to Italy, which is under Article 15. That was ceded with the Treaty of Paris back to Greece. So that's a different, but we'll just discuss that as well because it's important about the status and many other things in regards to that. That also are claims that it was given to the Italians to look after, some crazy assertions that are made, which is completely and utterly false. Article 13. With a view of ensuring the maintenance of peace, the Greek government undertakes to observe the following restrictions in the islands of Mytilene, Chios, Samos, and Ikaria. One, no naval bases, fortifications will be established in the said islands. Okay? Just these ones here. That's it. Only those ones. Okay? Not all of them. Just these big islands. Just to make it quite clear, because a lot of people are claiming all sorts of things when it's just those damn 4 islands. Naval bases. Why would you put a naval base so close to a potential adversary is beyond me. And no fortifications. And that would be a waste of time, especially with modern artillery and modern technology for fortifications. So it's irrelevant to the modern era in particular. Greece complies with this. Never has established a naval base, never established fortifications. Simple as that. Now, this provision and this provision that I'll read now is sort of defunct, but I'll explain later on. This provision still stands. This hasn't changed. This has not been superseded by any future. And it says the Greek military aircraft will be forbidden to fly over the territory of Anatolian coast. That means that 3-mile limit. So from there, that coastline of 3 miles, you can't fly over that. It's illegal. Okay, that's what it's saying. Got it? You're not allowed over. Oops, sorry. Yeah, got it. Reciprocally, the Turkish government will forbid their military aircraft to fly over the said islands. Now, we know that they fly over these islands because they've even been registered with NATO. But NATO doesn't seem to do, really, they're only concerned when Russia or China violate international law. But when Turkey violates international law, they say nothing, even though they've got the evidence. They've got the radar pictures from radars, US radars and all that. They know quite clearly because we've given them also from Greek radars exact coordinates. They know that. They've got the information. They usually just shelve it. That's what happens, unfortunately. So the documents exist, but they just shelve it. And they are constantly overflying a lot of the islands blatantly. So the reality is they've been photographed, pictured, all sorts of things, even by tourists. So they are clearly violating Article 13, paragraph 2. Okay? And there was only one case years ago that a Greek pilot, in frustration, this was a conflict where they had actually done, I can't remember the incident, but there was some incident that actually the Turks had done in the Aegean, and this pilot just overflew Smyrna, their airbase there, and scared the bejeevers off them with an F4 Phantom. He was reprimanded when he got back to Greece and landed, but that's the only violation that's ever happened. So just to be fair, so nobody says I'm not, disclosing everything, because somebody may find it and go, oh, what about that incident? Yes, I've disclosed it. So Let's leave it at that. And it says the third part, the Greek military force is in the said islands will be limited to the normal contingent called up for military service. That means conscripts. Conscripts from the islands. My nephew, who's on one of the islands, actually served on one of the islands. So he's allowed to because he's an islander. So he's within the Aegean Islands. So he's got under this, he's allowed, which will be trained on the spot as well as to a force of gendarmerie and police. Now, gendarmerie is a French word for National Guard, for internal security, stuff like that. Now, I know that National Guards do tend to basically occasionally in the US military get deployed overseas, but in most other countries, they are usually for internal security and border security, nothing else. That's their role. And since there were no real restrictions on some of the military hardware that they could actually have, today in the modern stuff, they're quite well armed because they're defending the islands because there is an existential threat. There is a big amphibious force on the other side in Smyrna, the port of Smyrna, and it's quite a big, sizable, it's one of the biggest amphibious forces in the Mediterranean. So I don't think it's there. It's sort of bigger size than even the one that landed in Cyprus. So yes, I don't think it's there to basically, do an invasion of, like Russia or elsewhere. It's definitely on the other side of the Aegean, on the eastern part of the Aegean. So it's quite clearly what it's intended for. So, so obviously we maintain forces on those islands. And the actual thing does not prohibit military force. As you can see, all it prohibits is naval bases and fortifications. Okay, it doesn't prohibit military forces, but just stipulates that they will be conscripts and the people who are training them, so military officers that are training these conscripts, so small contingent of military forces plus conscripts that are being trained, plus gendarmerie, police in proportion. So the gendarmerie police have to be in proportion to the force of gendarmerie and police existing in the whole of the Greek territory, the rest of Greece. Now, I will cover that as well. Police force, Hellenic police force. And it preceded the Hellenic gendarmerie. In the cities. But it's a sort of a paramilitary group. Now it's put under the army. But it still functions in that role. 65,000. There's a document. This is Military Balance, which is a periodical put out. I think it's in the UK. Anyway, I can't remember now. And they do all about. I couldn't actually find any numbers on Wikipedia, so I have to use this document. So, this one I won't be able to link because I'm not allowed, unless you want to go and buy it. And where are we? I went past that. Come back. Okay. So this is the page. That's the Greek Navy. Here it is. Internal security role. National Guard, 33,000. Okay. So obviously there's not 65,000. Even if there was, just to give you an idea. So 33. And even if there was 5,000 on some of these coastal islands along that coast, there's not that amount, not even the whole Aegean. It's small populations, but we'll just go for argument's sake. Times 2, 76,000 would be the double amount. So that minus 65,000, 11,000, and you've got a number of gendarmerie forces on mainland Greece, which is especially in the rural areas primarily, and there's slightly more than that. You know, not all those numbers are on the islands, the 33,000, but I'm just doing a rough thing now. But basically, it's half-half, which is pretty much within compliance of the treaty. So Greece is pretty good at trying to maintaining that, because that's why nobody's ever been able to argue against that point, because they can't. They can check the numbers, the stats. So, but anyway, even this has been superseded, and that's been superseded. So those provisions are not. Now you'll say, well, why does Greece comply with that, with this part, even though it's been superseded? Well, it does because it's easy to administer. They don't want regular forces on the islands because gendarmerie, they come from a lot of the local population, the ones that are on the islands. A couple of thousand here or there, they come from the local islands. It's much easier to have people that come from the islands. The more, let's say, they'll have more interest in defending them if their families are on there, if you know what I mean. So it's like the National Guard in America, each one from each state. You're committed to the state because your family's there, you're connected. There's a stronger connection. And so Greece considers that they will fight to the death. And so it's much better to keep them on the islands than anyone else. So as you can see, all these islands, National Guard, National Guard, National Guard, National Guard, National Guard, National Guard, full compliance with the Treaty of Lausanne, even though those articles have been superseded. But even with the old articles, they're still compliant. As you can see, all the other regular forces are all up here, except this one on Crete, which is the air mobility one. Anyway, but that comes under the islands and the interior. So that's the islanders and the interior command, which is this ESDEN, and all the National Guard ones are under here, excluding this. It used to be, they haven't changed it, have they? Wikipedia, please. It's a brigade size now. It's no longer a division. It was downgraded to an air mobility. Anyway, so, and as you can see, Marina here is basically, just to cover that, Marina is Lesbos. It's just the old name of the actual of the region. The military still uses the old name of the district, the old district name. Anyway, it's just one of those things that names stick. Rhodes is outside that, and some of these other islands are outside that treaty. So, and they make discussions about these islands, but they're not even named to be under those restrictions. So, and even there, the Greek governments decided just to put National Guard right through and no regular military, even in Rhodes, which, Rhodes, yeah, we'll get to all that sort of stuff, which is basically Dodecanese, which is another thing that is discussed, which goes right down to Castellotis, or which gets discussed. But let's continue with the treaty. So Article 14, the islands of Imbros and Tenado remaining under Turkish sovereignty. Okay, that's just sovereignty, shall enjoy a special administrative organization. Got it? Composed of local elements and furnishing every guarantee for the native non-Muslim population insofar as concerns local administration, protection of persons and property, something that was completely and utterly, not done. The maintenance order will be assured therein by a police force recruited from amongst the local population, by the local administration above provided for and placed under its orders. So the local administration, which is basically from the local people, the non-Muslim people, which is Greeks basically, they'll also have their local police force. These were never happened. On the opposite, they sent a whole lot of nasty far-right people and even prisoners they released on the island deliberately to harass the locals and then started killing them and doing all sorts of nasty things, raping women and all sorts, and basically forcing people off the islands. So in complete violation of the provisions that the locals would administer and also police their own areas. There was only permitted for Turks to have some military, minor military presence there, for observation purposes and all that, for the protection of the Dardanelles, which were demilitarized under this treaty, and some previous provisions that had been from the London Agreement and all that sort of stuff. So that's the reality, even on that, where they quite clearly violated through pogroms and ethnic cleansing of these two islands. The agreements which have been or may be concluded between Greece and Turkey relating to the exchange of the Greek and Turkish populations will not be applied to the inhabitants of the islands of Imbros and Tenador. So there was an exchange of populations between the two countries, so whoever was Turk went one way, whoever was Greek went the other way into Greece. The only people that were basically allowed were the Greek Muslims in Western Thrace, and that Turkey is actually undertaking a hybrid warfare to try and actually make them think that they are something different than what they are, is quite a travesty in itself. And it's also been the Greek government also that was involved in some of that in the earlier parts, which didn't really support those communities, which is also disgraceful because they were citizens of the country. But they are definitely not. If they claim that they are Turks, they should have been transferred and should be deported under this treaty. So I would say to the Greek government, if I was Prime Minister, I would say, you claim you're Turkish, okay, we're deporting you to Turkey. Because under the provisions of the treaty, only people on these islands don't get exchanged, and the people that were in, like, Constantinople, Istanbul, also the well over 100,000 Greeks that were there also had protection under that exchange thing. Anyway, we'll move on. Turkey renounces in favor of Italy. That's the Article 15. So Turkey renounces, okay? They didn't hand them over, the Dodecanese. They renounced in favor of Italy all rights and title. All rights. They have zero rights and title over the following islands. Blah, 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 roads, blah, 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 go, which are now occupied by Italy, and the islets dependent upon thereupon. So all the rocks and islands and islets and all that are dependent on these islands that were named, the whole lot, course, and all that. And remember, of course, there's a National Guard on that. Okay, that's not under the treaty. They claim that that shouldn't be there because it violates the treaty. What? Have you read the treaty? Maybe you should read the treaty, which now occupied by Italy and the islets depending upon, and also over the island of Castellorizos, which is right at the end of this chain of islands, the Dodecanese, as they're called. That's the one that actually stuffs up their economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean, gives it mostly to Greece because of its under international law. They really dislike that. They say, oh, it's so close to the Turkish territory. Well, when it was Italian, they didn't actually make that claim because the Italian had a bigger navy and could blast them. So they respected the law then. They don't seem to now, that it's given back to us under the Treaty of Paris, which as war reparations, but see, the Italians had full rights of title over those. So when they gave them back, they relinquished them to us as full right of title under the Paris Treaty, as war reparations for what they did to us in the Second World War. So, you were saying, what a load of hogwash. These were given to basically, anyway, that's pretty much the sort of articles and what they cover. Then it goes down to a whole lot of other things there, and other provisions and other areas about debt and, to the Egyptians and all sorts of other things. Turkey hereby recognises the annexation of Cyprus proclaimed by the British government on this, whatever, November 14. So, okay. So Cyprus, you got no rights in Cyprus as well. Illegal occupation. Never had any rights. You gave it over to Britain, and then Britain actually declared it independent, and it's a recognised state of the UN. So you've got no rights. So get out. You're illegally trespassing on other people's land. So, yeah. So that's pretty much that treaty. And then we'll go on to the Treaty of Montreux. So these are the countries that were involved. This was in 1936 when relationships between Turkey and Greece were much better. And Greece participated in that. Australia, Bulgaria, France, Greece, Japan, Romania, Yugoslavia, Turkey, United Kingdom, and also the Soviet Union, because that's what it was back then. This was in regards to the Bosporus Strait and the remilitarization of the Bosporus Strait. So all this area, see, these are the islands of Imbros and Denador, the sort of the ones that were given to protect the Bosporus with the Greek population, well, with the ex-Greek populations that were basically forced out and never given their legal rights. So the Greek government has never taken any action against on that violation of the provision is outrageous, but they were under pressure from the Americans not to create waves in NATO. I can tell you if I was Prime Minister, I'd tell the Americans to go take a hike, and I'd basically be putting the provision and demanding international sanctions. So, but that's me, because basically you want to be good neighbors, you want us to have good relations and not squabble about it, respect the treaties. You took a lot of territory from us originally back in the old days. We liberated a part of it, not all of it. We went to Asia Minor because there was massive Greek populations there, and you guys had started slaughtering them from 1914. It'd been already, killings of Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians. So we were forced to go there. We weren't an imperialist army. We were going there to protect and defend those people from slaughter. And they had been there for thousands of years, way before you ever turned up. So we're the indigenous people of the region, not you. Don't you forget that. We've got far more historic rights in that regard. And so this is basically, as mentioned in the preamble of the convention replaced. So this is in the preamble. I couldn't get a copy of the damn treaty, so to read out the part. I'll see if I can find one. If I can actually come up with one, a copy, I will put it up. This treaty, but basically the stipulation is a conversion replaced the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne of 20 on the Straits, which stated the demilitarization of the Greek islands of Limnos and Samothraki. Remember we were talking about these islands, in the treaty. Okay. And let's go back to it. Along with the demilitarization of the Dardanelles, Sierra Marmaras, and Bosporus. Okay. So basically, what has actually happened is this treaty has allowed, because Turkey claimed that, the world had become changed. There were threats to our country at the time, and we need to, because they actually made the request. See, the key weakness of the present regime were machinery for collective guarantee was too slow and ineffective, and there was no contingent for a greater threat of war, no provision for Turkey to defend itself. Turkey was therefore prepared to enter into negotiations with a view of arriving to the near future of conclusion agreement regulation the regime of the Straits under the condition of security, which was indispensable for the inviolable of Turkey's territory in the most liberal spirit for the constant development of commercial navigation between the Mediterranean and Black Sea. So they actually made the request to the different governments. So, so as you can see here, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne had demilitarized the Dardanelles and opened the Straits and restricted civilian and military traffic under the provisions of the International Straits Commission of the League of Nations. And basically in the 1930s, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean had altered with the rise of fascist Italy, which controlled the Greek inhabited Dodecanese, which is the islands, Dodecanese, which is those islands down there, which we've discussed how they were given back to Greece after the Second World War. So, the islands off the west of Turkey had constructed fortifications and roads, Leros and Kos. The Turks feared that Italians would seek to exploit access to the Straits. So they requested basically for this meeting. And at the times, between that period, Greece and the response was generally favourable, including with Greece, and many of these other countries. And at the time, basically the Turks said you can remilitarize yours, so those provisions have gone. So pretty much, Greece is not going to build naval bases or fortifications because in the modern era they'd just be blasted to bits. They're too close. So that's irrelevant in the modern era. They're not going to change this. They're not going to basically put regular forces on because it's too costly. It's easier to put gendarmerie. The cost is less. It's all about money for the Greek government. It's not that it's restricted to this part of the provision, because this treaty removed that. So, sorry. I'm just going to pause it until I can basically get my back again after that choking event. Anyway, it's part of the family genetics, probably. My auntie, mum's oldest sister, she died from choking. Yes. It's a bit of a family curse. Anyway, let's move on. So that's pretty much the actual treaty, the changes that actually happen and stuff like that. So all that sort of nonsense, whatever belongs to them belongs up to 3 miles from their coast. The rest is Greek. And a lot of these provisions that demilitarized. Now, there's just one other thing that I need to cover in terms of these islands down here, the Dodecanese, that were handed back from the Italians. Now, at the time, at the end of after things were sort of signed, the Soviet Union asked for those islands not to be militarized with regular troops, not with National Guards, but with regular troops. Now, under that provision, this is the reason why the Greeks put National Guards there rather than regular military, which they were going to. They actually asked that for their own security needs, because they came through here, through these international waters, and then getting through this part was very close to their access into the Mediterranean. They didn't want roads in particular being militarized because it's narrow here. That was the reason primarily. And that was an agreement with the Soviet Union and Greece, for them to get them to sign it. But since, and international law is quite clear on this, only parties to an agreement can dispute the other party. So if you're not part of the agreement, you can't basically go around and say, well, you violated the agreement. No, you can't say, because you're not part of the agreement. Now, Greece and the Soviet Union were part of that agreement in order to get basically the Soviet Union to sign off on the transfer of the rights and the islands. But since the Soviet Union no longer exists, it's only one party, that's Greece. So that's null and void. So if Greece wanted to put forces there, they could, but they don't because they're not interested. It's too costly. National Guards are cheaper. Believe me, they're cheaper. That's why people have National Guards for internal security and border security. They're cheaper than regular troopers. You pay more, and you need regular troopers to be trained for regular warfare, not for basically protecting borders. So, so that's pretty much it for that. Now, in 1920, the Turks claimed that, the Greeks were, after they'd slaughtered so many Greeks and many of the military soldiers as they were retreating. And again, they were outside Ankara. And actually, Kemal was actually about to sue for peace. And then the major powers pressured Greece to withdraw back to the coast. Otherwise, they would not support them. The Greek government did some really crazy decisions, replaced the military officers that were there, and then ordered back those forces. As a consequence, they sort of disbanded in a disorganized manner and were basically slaughtered. So when they were nearly about to have victory, ridiculous. But anyway, that's how it happens sometimes in warfare. They should have pressed the case, not and ignored the foreign powers and their pressures. That should be a lesson to the current leadership in Greece, not to basically to put the national interest first and ignore foreign powers and all their little intrigues, which would have cost us a lot and a lot of deaths and a lot of people getting slaughtered. Now, Erdogan basically says, the Greeks did so many crimes and so were so nasty in Asia Minor when they were here. What a load of crap. This guy, Aristides Steliadis, this is Wikipedia as well. Steliadis was appointed the High Commissioner of Smyrna in February and arrived in the city 4 days after the 15th of May 1919 landing of the Greek military. So 4 days later, because he turned up. He immediately went to work in setting up an administration, easing ethnic violence. I don't see, genocide on the Greek side, and making plans for a permanent annexation of Smyrna for a referendum. The majority of people there were Greek at the time, to basically transfer, and there would have been a referendum, and it will be also. He punished Greek soldiers responsible for violence on the 15th, 16th of May with court-martial. I don't see a pogrom there or ethnic cleansing or violence or murder or that. He actually punished. He was actually berated in the Greek media at the time. This is back 1920s where people were much more nationalistic and all that. And created a commission to decide on payments for victims, to compensate the victims against these people who were criminals and were tried for war crimes, these soldiers. That doesn't seem that the Greek state was basically a genocidal like the Turkish state. Made up of representatives, so an independent commission of Great Britain, France, Italy, and other allies. So there would be no bias. So this Greek governor sets up a commission to compensate the victims, and also his own courts try these Greek soldiers, and basically sets up an independent commission that's, above board to basically compensate the victims. Yes. Yeah, we've been told a lot of fibs by Mr. Erdogan. And even after, I won't go into all this person's story, he was berated and hated by the Greek media at the time. But even when the government changed and the royalists came in power, um, they basically didn't replace him. The media was scathing of them as well. So they were scathing of the previous government and the new government. They'd made a lot of mistakes, strategic mistakes. But anyway, that's another story. I'm not going to go into that because that's not the purpose of this. It's just basically to show that, the actual commissioner of there made sure that any violence or misbehavior on the part of Greek soldiers was punished. Yeah, I'd like to see that was back in 1920, 1919, or around about there. Very long time ago. And he kept it up, even right up to the time that he left. He was basically punishing Greek soldiers that basically had violated any rules and all that. So yeah, I don't see the Americans punishing their soldiers when they've done inappropriate things and all sorts of other things. But yeah, back then, we actually had much higher standards than even today. Many other military in Europe and elsewhere have standards, okay? And then we've got the arrogant Erdogan basically pointing the finger when our own governor punished back then. And we're talking about a period where people were less educated, more prone to violence in a sense, and more had more tribalistic attitudes and behaviors, but less, middle class are a bit more sophisticated in the way they avoid violence basically. Back then you had a lot of peasants and people like that, average people that were more prone to that sort of stuff in all communities. The difference is that, the Greeks, even back then, had better standards than many Europeans and many others. It's in our culture, even in our political opponents, we send them into exile. You don't kill, only on the battlefield you kill people, because otherwise it's, it's a major crime. So you can only kill, and even then it's a sin under our faith, but it's sort of a forgivable sin in a sense if your weapons are blessed by a priest. But otherwise, you can't kill people because then it's outright murder, and it's basically wrong. And that's why Greece doesn't have a death penalty, and why people in the past were sent into exile, even in ancient Greece, even under the Byzantium Empire, the so-called Eastern Roman Empire. And to this day, it's not our way. So yes, so it's outrageous for the people who fought with the Mongol hordes and slaughtered and genocided people left, right, and center have now the audacity to claim otherwise in terms of the Greek people. So we've got there's a whole lot of, if people want to go and look into, foreign correspondents, British, American, and many others that were there that were recording this sort of thing, they praised the Greek authorities, how well they behaved and how well they treated the locals and how well they basically punished the guilty and compensated the victims. So, it's quite outrageous what Erdogan is saying. It's people, relatives of his past, that slaughtered people left, right, and center, and and it has got the audacity to point the finger towards the Greeks. Then he also points the finger at certain people in Albanians in Greece. Now, at the time of the Second World War, Albanians collaborated. Some, not all, some collaborated with the occupation forces of Italians and not only Albanians, even some Greeks collaborated with the Germans and the Italians. They were collaborators, So it's fair game with collaborators. That's how it goes. Now, the conservative guerrilla force, they basically, at the end of the war, they attacked some of these people, some of these relatives of these collaborators, and killed them. Now, obviously, that's criminal. You shouldn't take it out on their relatives, and that's wrong in that sense. But they were guerrilla fighters. They weren't part of the Greek government. They were guerrilla fighters. And another thing that people don't tell you is that about a third of that force of guerrilla fighters were actually Albanian Greeks. So these were people of Albanian racial heritage who were born in Greece and lived in Greece. Under the Treaty of Lausanne, they because they weren't Greek Muslims, they should have been sent to Turkey, and the Albanian government asked Greece if they could be allowed to stay in Greece. Actually requested it, which technically Greece didn't have to oblige. Could have deported them. We would have not had the problem at all. But anyway, the Greek government, again, even back then, after it fought so many wars, was willing to basically say, well, yeah, okay, these people have lived here for a very long time. We're not going to force them out. And that's most other countries wouldn't have done that. But Greece did, Again, another feather in their cap for decency, even back then in the 1920s. So, which was a much more violent time than what it is today. Well, the thinking, at least, much more tribalistic in the thinking. And at that time, in the Second World War, a third of those forces were basically people that had had their own relatives attacked by these occupation forces and these collaborators who had killed many of their relatives. So it was payback sort of thing. It's not the right to take two wrongs don't make a right, so to speak. But you can understand people having lost many of their relatives, starvation, deaths, and executions for supporting the rebels. Obviously these people were angry and all that. And so, with a large contingent of that conservative guerrilla force being Albanian, but loyal to the Greek society, they didn't collaborate. They joined the Greek forces, guerrilla forces. They were also involved in that. So, to say that it was a Greek against Albanian is just bullshit. And, the amount, there wasn't hundreds of thousands. We're talking about a couple of hundred people and stuff like that. So specific families that were collaborators. That's the sort of people. But that wasn't part of, many of these people left with the occupation forces into Albania and then basically resided there after the war, so to speak. When the Greek government took over, the Greek government guaranteed the protection of their property rights, something that Turkey never did. They forced all these Greeks out of these islands, Invros and Denizli, off large parts like in the Pogron, which I'll show shortly, in Istanbul, the Constantinople's Pogron, where many people lost their properties and livelihoods and even their lives in some cases and were never compensated by the Turkish authorities. The Greek government guaranteed to this day those lands cannot be sold, cannot be misused or misappropriated or whatever. They're still protected by the Greek government, even though these were collaborationists. The land, their property rights were protected. That's the rule of law. That's how a country that respects the rule of law acts, even after a war. And now local people can use those lands. They rent them off the government, they use them, and they have a right to use them as long as they look after them. But if the title holders come back and request them, they'll give them back to them. They just, some people have returned back and they've sold the properties, but not many for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe they don't know that the properties exist, but they do. So if people still hold titles, they can actually come back and actually ask for those property rights, and maybe they'll sell them and take the proceeds and go back to Albania with the proceeds. That's their business, what they're going to do with them. But Greece to this day protects those property rights. So then they say, oh, the Greeks genocided. This is another Turkish lie from Erdogan in recent times when he was in Smyrna saying this, but that's not the case. These were rebels just taking revenge. This wasn't the Greek government taking revenge. Okay? The Greek government doesn't work like that. We follow the rule of law and respect international law and stuff like that. Unlike, the genocidal Islamofascists on the other side in Ankara Anyway, now these were called the September events. Septembriana, we call them in Greece, because that's when they happened, the pogroms, when these grey wolves, sort of described as genocide. Greek minority, this was back in the sort of 50s. Remember what I was saying? Turkey sort of changed directions in 1953, where the deep establishment was pushing a new agenda to re-establish the Ottoman Empire. And obviously, these minorities had to be pushed out. So they organised, anti-Greek mobs directly. There's a series of government-sponsored anti-Greeks, and even the media said, oh, these Greeks have done all this; they deserve to die. So it was quite a nasty time. And so, what triggered the event? Fake news. It's not a. It's an old thing. Fake news. It's not new. Which stated that the day before, Greeks had bombed the Turkish consulate in Thessalonica, the house where Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was born, which is also bullshit. See, Greece is quite really reasonable. They even gave the Turks the house of Kemal to create their consulate. Most other governments wouldn't have done that. They would have said, nah, you can have somewhere else. We're not giving you the house. They probably would have torn it down. Yeah, exactly. A bomb which was planted by a Turkish usher at the consulate, who was later arrested and confessed, incited the events. The Turkish press was silent about the arrest, obviously, because it didn't follow the narrative. Instead, it insinuated that Greeks had set off the bomb. So, Turkish mob, most of those members were trucked into the city in advance, assaulted Istanbul community for 9 hours, blah, blah, blah. They attacked other minorities as well and all that, and destroyed $500 million worth in those days, which is, now in the multiple billions, burning churches, devastating shops, private homes, and all that. No respect, absolute barbarity and, ethnic cleansing. That's why it's called a pogrom. So basically, this is what happened. So community that was well over 100,000, as Human Rights Watch now testifies, about 2,500. Most people have been forced out. It's a very intolerant society for minorities, especially for Greeks and Armenians, Christians in particular. Turkey, very hostile place in that regard. So just keep that in mind. These are sources, nothing to do with me. These actually really happened. They recorded their pictures and all that. People can check them out for themselves. They sort of characterize that similar to the Nazi Kristallnacht, against the Jews. It was very similar. They actually put crosses on people's homes and businesses so the rioters would know exactly what belonged to whom. So, yeah, very nasty stuff. Now, Erdogan basically criticized some of that, to win a bit of favor with the international crowd. But, that was just, crocodile tears, basically. That was just BS in some years back that he did that. And that was sort of because it was around that period, there was probably a bit of pressure international, I'd say. So it wasn't genuine, let's be honest. So that's his party, AKP, People's Alliance. This is who he's allied with, Baksili, So that's the Nationalist Movement Party, basically a neo-fascist. It's basically a Nazi party, let's put it that way. That's who he's in alliance with to keep power, basically with the Nazi party. That's why he swung so far to the right and started to use some of their rhetoric. And, this is the leader. This is the guy here, you know, he's a founding member of the Grey Wolves, officially known in short, you know, as idealist Heaths, is a Turkish far right. It's a Nazi organization, basically. Let's be honest. They were been involved in a lot of crimes and violence against minorities. So they're neo-Nazis, basically. They basically have, you know, they have this salute, which they do, which is that one there, which is basically a neo-Nazi Turkish group. Some of these groups were actually set up as paramilitary organizations by the CIA deliberately as anti-communist organizations. You know, if Europe gets conquered by the Soviet Union, we need to have these nasties to basically fight against the rearguard action, a guerrilla warfare against them. That's how they were basically funded and why they exist today, unfortunately. But that's the reality of a lot of those organizations. But I'm not going to go into that at this stage. No. This is recent sort of stuff that they've been involved, you know, basically mob attacks against Syrian shops, you know. So these extremists, that's their name in Turkish, Ulkuk movement or Grey Wolves. There they are doing the salute. That's the Grey Wolf salute. They are very racist towards not only Greeks and Armenians and people like that, but also Arabs. So they're very hostile to Semitic people like Arabs, Jews, people like that. So, as I said, they're a neo-fascist, a Nazi, the equivalent of a Nazi party in Turkey. They've been around and they've been involved in all these pogroms and ethnic cleansing episodes throughout Turkey's history from very early days. Their actual leader, this guy, is a founding member, but he's not the leader of the movement. He's the leader of this party, which gets support from the Grey Wolves. But the actual leader is somebody who's involved in narco. You know, I mean, this is the sort of they're involved in massacres, assassinations, bombings, and this is how they get their money, their revenue: arms trafficking, illegal drug trade, extortion, human trafficking. They're a criminal organization, not only a terrorist organization, but a criminal organization. And they put down here that these are their opponents, the Kurds. That's nonsense. They're opponents. Anyone who's not Turkish, even some Turks, they hate and have killed, like Turkish reporters and people like that don't follow their sort of belief systems. So these are very nasty people. So extremely violent groups. That's the sort of organizations that have taken control and are influencing the leadership of Turkey, the deep state. They're very dangerous people, very threatening, and they're very good liars in basically just making up crap about these treaties and stuff like that. So that's the island Castellotes, or which they say they can swim across and actually take it from the coastline. They always say that. This is really annoys them because they lose massive in the exclusive economic zone. But that's geography, Sometimes geography is is inconvenient. But international law says the law of the sea, and these treaties exactly where the borders lie. So it's not me saying it; it's the actual international treaties. They've signed them. They actually won territory. We'd actually taken part of Minor Asia. We'd moved in, taken Eastern Thrace, all that. Under these treaties, we relinquished a lot of territory to these people. Now they want more. Well, they're not getting any more, Enough is enough. They want to live in peace with us. They need to stop their revisionist ideas and attitudes towards Greece. It's unacceptable for these sort of attitudes and approaches. If you want be a good neighbor, you need to behave yourself and basically live within international law and all that. I mean, Greeks are quite reasonable. I mean, if the Turks basically said, look, we'll sign a non-aggression pact, we'll accept all these things, we'll pull our forces out of Cyprus, you'd actually get a communal agreement on Cyprus, which would really settle everything there. You'd get also, the Greeks would probably give them exploration rights in their own exclusive economic zone to get some energy security for themselves, because Greece is much smaller, doesn't require, you know, they would just have a resource rent tax on them like they have on the foreign companies. But they would get some energy security from a neighbor that basically doesn't want their, we have to live with them. At the end of the day, Greece has to live with Turkey and Turkey has to live with Greece. Geography has stuck us together, whether people like it or not. There are a lot of reasonable people in Turkey and people that don't want the escalation of this conflict, like a lot of people in Greece. But unfortunately, the more radicals, the more extremist forces and all that are fomenting violence and hatred and are pushing a narrative which just ignores these things. And I think also the Turks themselves need to own up to their past genocide. No different than the Germans did for their Jewish, and many other killings that they undertook, because that's the right thing to do. You need to own up, because if you don't own up, you can't move forward. And it's really important that, if we look back in our history as human beings, there's probably many dark spots that all of us can point to, some worse, some less worse, depending. But at the end of the day, we can't live in the past either. But we have to respect international law. We have to respect where the borders lie and not violate them and not threaten your neighbour with war if they exercise their rights under international law to extend their territory by 12 nautical miles. They will create corridors of free passage. Greece has said that quite clearly, like all countries. It's required under the international law to create corridors, So if you extend your territory and you basically now no longer there is international territory as a corridor in certain parts, especially in the Dodecanese and all that, they'll end up creating a corridor and another one coming in from the west and all that. I've actually seen some of the plans and all that, so where the corridors more or less will be. So they do exist. They just basically haven't put it into action because of the pressure from the Americans not to do it, because the Turks have this casus belli, a declaration of war, and NATO doesn't want the southeast of the NATO alliance blowing up in smoke is the real reason. But if I was Prime Minister of Greece, I would basically do it and tell the Americans, I'm doing it, you sort out the Turks. Send over a couple of carrier battle groups off the Turkish coast and send troops into Western Thrace, and then see if they actually make a move. They won't. And they'll have to back down. And you can avoid a conflict and everything can get resolved and force the Turkish governments to change their behavior. Because, it's ridiculous, the whole situation. And it shouldn't go on. It's gone on for far too long, these situations. The illegal occupation of Northern Cyprus has gone on for too long. And so, we're all concerned about Ukraine, but it seems, if you're a Greek, nobody cares about you, about your, even though we're indigenous, even, the Ukraine and all that, all that, which is called Euxenos Pondos, which is, is a different name for the Black Sea. It's, it's changed later on, but that was the original name. We're the indigenous people of that as well. We've been there for thousands of years, Greeks, before Slavs turned up or anyone turned up. Now, there's still a community there in the eastern part of, but it's diminishing, and many of them have, been attacked and all sorts of things. So, yeah, we may see another immigration of Greeks leaving ancestral lands and heading basically to Greece or elsewhere. So, another possibility. So, I think sometimes Greeks can, it's only when their back's against the wall they fight like hell. But otherwise, it's sort of, yeah, she'll be right. You know, they're too cool, too relaxed in a sense. And, but, you know, I always say to people, careful. Greeks are, you know, we're very social people, very easygoing. But if you piss us off and you attack us and you anger us, we're lethal. Just look at our history. We outnumbered forces multiple times and we defeated them. Even in the Second World War, we defeated the Italians and the Germans on both fronts. The middle collapsed. Guess who was looking after that? The British. They collapsed and then outflanked our forces. Our forces never surrendered to the Germans. They took their military colours with them. They just handed over their weapons because they said to the Germans, we'll fight to the death. And the Germans said, that will keep us from activating Operation Barbarossa. We can't have that. Well, you can go. We won't fight you anymore. Even Dietrich, with his Panzer SS division, thought that he was fighting 4 times the forces. He was actually fighting a quarter of equivalent. His was no infantry. He had Panzer division. He was shocked when he found out after. So, yeah, we're pretty lethal when we get going. We liberated the northern part, but we've also got a lot of empathy, even for our enemies. You'll be surprised. From antiquity, we're probably the only people that have ever written stories for our enemies' families and stuff like that. It's a Greek thing. I'm not going to go into it. It's a Greek thing. Even after the Persians were pushed out of Greece, for some of their dead people, for their families, they wrote poems and things like that, the Greeks back in antiquity. And even when they liberated, like Dramai was defeated, he outnumbered the Greeks 10-1. He had about 20,000 troops. Kolokotronis had about 2,000. Actually, even in West Point, the US, they study this fighting against the Armenians by Kolokotronis. You know, the Americans know this. Anybody that's gone to West Point knows exactly what I'm talking about because they would have actually learnt it in their studies. So it was one of the classical of, you know, brilliant guerrilla warfare against outnumbered forces 10-1. So, and you know what? After that fight, he actually died. And they wrote a poem and sort of song for his mother, to a mourning song to mourn the passing of her son. That's the difference. That's why even that guy who was the governor took action back then. We're not a people that basically kills people just like that in cold blood. We're not a genocidal people. We're a people that respects life. We always have. That's why Western civilization was built on our culture, on respecting the individual and respecting life. You're us. Western culture is our culture. You're us. You know, foundation of those things, you know, and it's outrageous that other Westerners don't come to our defense. And it's outrageous that the Turkish deep state is allowed to get away with the outrageous statements that they make. You know, pisses me off quite a bit. I've got nothing against the Turkish people. I've even got some subscribers. You know, I hope they don't unsubscribe, but they really need to look at their own society. And a lot of them also were stolen from our people. You know, what do you think? So many Turks turned up? No. A lot of those people living in Asia Minor were basically stolen children from Greek families. Most on the coastal, especially on the west coast and all that, most of them are Greek. They don't know. They were assimilated into the Turkish culture and told you're Turkish. But if they do a 23andMe and look at the haplogroups, they'll actually find their genetics are Greek. They'll be surprised. Some of them have actually checked and found out. And I think with these genetic tests, if more Turks do that and realize who they are, maybe they'll realize, okay, I'm a Greek Turk. I'm not a Turk from Central Asia, because they look different. You just have to take a look at Central Asian Turks. They look like you. You look more European, more like Greeks, because most of you are. You've just been basically stolen as children. Well, your ancestors were stolen as children in this sort of this military Yanitsari, as they were called, Yanitari, or and yeah, people lost their culture and identity and all that. So yeah, it's happened in many parts of the world, where children are stolen from one indigenous ethnic group and turned into some, lost their identity. But yeah, check your genetics. This is why it's very hard for us Greeks, because we most of them over on the other side we know who, they are basically, we know their identity, and that makes it even harder. We're really conflicted when it comes to the people in Turkey, very conflicted. And most Greeks are have got very good relationships along the borders, those islands and all that. People go back and forward, visit Turks, Greeks, so we get on pretty well. Forget about the politicians. We get on pretty well. It's unfortunate that more Turks are not standing up against the deep state in Turkey and saying enough is enough, this bullshit. Greeks are not violating these treaties. The deep state, the fascist deep state in Turkey is, and we need to dismantle it and actually turn a new leaf and make a better society. Because I would rather see a better society in Turkey and, joining the EU, even though it's a dysfunctional organization currently, we won't go into that. But, having closer relationships with those countries of that entity, hopefully can get better. That's the hope for most Europeans, I suspect. But there's a future there that doesn't involve us killing each other. There's a future there that basically can put us on a different path, but you have to accept your past. You gotta basically take responsibility for all that's happened. You can't sweep it under the carpet and hide it like the deep state does, and whips up nationalism and all that to hide the crimes and all that. You need to own these things. And when you do, you'll become better people. Honestly, the truth will liberate you. And then you can join the rest of the world proud even though you may know that you're ethnically Greek by doing a genetic test. Culturally, you've been assimilated in the Turkish world, I understand. I'm not trying to force you to, some people have left Turkey, come to Greece to try and learn the language and become part. The culture is very similar in many regards because, many of you are ethnic Greeks that were converted. And you do notice a difference between the west part of Turkey and the interior, very different. There are, because of the different cultural bases that you originated from. But really, you really need to look into your hearts and make a change, because we're not going anywhere. And we know you're not going anywhere. So we can either be at each other's throats for the next 1,000 years or whatever, or we can basically try and actually, live peacefully together. And you guys need to start respecting the rules you signed and make amends for the past. Even kind words and showing remorse for what has happened and stuff like that. I mean, Greeks are not going to go after you for compensation and money and all that sort of stuff. If they were to do that, they would have done it a long time ago. They just want to live peacefully with you. I mean, I live in Australia, but I've got relatives over there. At the end of the day, I mean, I know Turkish people, and I had two Turkish friends. I've gone into stage, but most people are people anywhere you go. The reality is that leaders whip up hatred and stuff like that. But when it comes to international law and the relationships between Greece and Turkey, Turkey's in the wrong when it comes. I've just shown you all the sort of that evidence, and you can go and look in it further yourselves, and don't look at Greek documents. Just go in and look at European, American correspondence about the times, those different periods. You can investigate. There's even links under there, those Wikipedia pages and all that. Check all that sort of stuff out. And slowly you'll realize that maybe what you've been taught at school isn't as truthful as, it's a lot of propaganda. Now, I know all countries have some level of historical propaganda or omission. Usually in Europe, it's omission. Even in Greece, some of the textbooks, they just omit things because they don't want to get into controversial areas. But that's how they operate. Where, unfortunately, in Turkey, in places like that, they really just lap on the lies because they want to cover up for, let's say, genocidal indiscretions and things like that. So, obviously, those bad Armenians and Greeks really deserved it, sort of thing, to justify. But, slaughtering people is not justifiable. Fighting soldiers with soldiers is one thing. Slaughtering innocent people is just unacceptable. It's war crimes. The Greek side, they were punished. On the Turkish side, they were encouraged in official documents, which have been seen, those Turkish documents. There's many websites that actually have the stuff, and even international newspapers that have actually published this sort of stuff. I'm not going to go into it. People can search it for themselves. This isn't sort of me trying to whip up hatred towards the Turks and say, look at all this evidence, and show pictures of, dead bodies and all that. That wasn't the purpose of this. People want to go into that, fine, go. There's plenty of websites that cover all that. This was really just to basically bring it for an international audience, to basically, who are not aware of the conflict and all that, to provide them with the evidence that basically, if they're basically challenged, you've got the evidence to say, well, that's not the case. You guys are violating the international, the treaties you've signed, on the one hand. And for those who are subscribers from Turkey that are on, or anywhere else, who have Turkish heritage, at least you can look at this and say, and get a bit of insight, and hopefully this will influence you to look into your own heritage, and influence you also to consider these things and read them for yourself and start thinking differently. Because the more Greeks and the more Turks start thinking differently in terms of each other, maybe we'll end up being able to live in peace rather than slaughtering each other again. Seems like every 100 years or whatever. So, not a good thing. So and at the end, what does it achieve? A lot of damage to property and life, and death of life. And it sets both societies, can set back decades and impoverish both people. So nobody wins those sort of conflicts, Let's not become pawns of major powers, so to speak, in that regard. But things need to change, in particular in Turkey, because that's where the major problems of the revisionist thinking is, which puts out propaganda that is basically is a complete lie in regards to these treaties. So if people can point these fallacies and lies out of Erdogan and Bekçi and many of the others who are making out complete and utter, nonsense, putting forward. Yes. And so even militarization had Greece militarise them with regular troops, those islands. A violation of a treaty doesn't relinquish title to the property. You've still got the title. It's like you having a property. You may have violated something, your council may be pissed off with you and say you need to fix it, correct that, but they can't take the property off you, you know? So it doesn't work like that. Your rights and title are yours to enjoy forever. Well, unless another war happens. But careful what you, because as I said, when the Greeks are on the warpath, just look at history. Very lethal, you know, because it's just our nature. We've been doing it for very, very long, believe me. Do not unleash our anger. You'll regret it for another 100 years. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. And hopefully some people got out of it. Some people now understand a bit of the background of this conflict, that it's basically, you know, Turkish deep state and their political establishment want to basically annex territory off Greece because it's got oil and gas energy, you know, reserves, which they want. It's simple as that, you know. And you know, and it's a violation of international law. What there any such action, and also the threats and stuff like that, like the threats of war, that they've got an article in their parliament. That's actually a violation of Article 2 of the UN. You can't threaten another member state of the UN. But they do, and nobody says anything, you know. But that's around it. Now you've got a bit of a background on this sort of stuff. So anyway, hope you got something out of it. That's about it. I'm out of here. See yous.